Okay. Well, I think it's a good time to start now. So, hello everyone, and welcome to what is the first webinar in a three-part series focusing on alternative proteins. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Tara, and I'm the director of Table. Table works with food system stakeholders to explore the future of food. We focus on the ways in which scientific evidence and social values inform often conflicting visions and arguments for change. So, in other words, we dig into and try to provide clarity both on the substance and the parameters of food system debate. So, where is it and why is it that we agree and disagree, while also offering opportunities for more thoughtful and constructive dialogue within the food community, with collaboration between 5 universities, and I'm based at Oxford. So anyway, on the subject of thoughtful and constructive dialogue, that leads me to the topic of this event, which is alternative proteins. So as you know, this is a category of food, both old and new, that some would argue provide more sustainable and potentially healthier alternatives to animal-based proteins. So the phrase itself encompasses everything from lentils and beans through to the veggie burgers that you see in the shops, through to the more novel forms, which for the most part are still in development. So that's in particular cell-cultivated meat and precision fermentation derived products. So it's in the debates around the last category of alternative proteins that we find the most heated and sort of most heat and contestation. And it's this specific category that provides the focus for our webinar series, which I'm pleased to say we're organising in collaboration with the UN Foundation and the UK's Food Standards Agency. So our overall goal with this series is to explore these new technologies thoughtfully in the round and in ways that move beyond some of the polarisation we've seen in the discussion so far. So among advocates, we want to understand what they see to be the biggest questions or problems. And among critics, we want to understand what framing conditions would help make those technologies more acceptable or at least countenanceable. So in this first webinar, we're going to be looking at investment trends, public attitudes, and the regulatory landscape. And I'm delighted to be joined by 3 great panelists. Dr. Yadira Tejeda Saldana, who's the Director of Responsible Research and Innovation at New Harvest, by Helen Brewood, who's a Senior Market and Consumer Insights Manager at Good Food Institute Europe, and a much missed ex-Table colleague, and Tom Vincent, who's the Deputy Director of Innovation at the UK's Food Standards Agency. Their bios should be posted in the chat. And I should also just highlight Joshua Rees, who's lurking in the background somewhere and who has been ably organising this series and will be producing a discussion paper off the back of it. So in this session, we'll be asking questions about who's investing in these products, what the role might be of the state versus of industry, what needs to be thought about when regulating the sector, and the potential differences between thinking about this as a public, thinking about these foods as a consumer on the one hand, or as a citizen on the other. So note just again, before I hand over, that we are specifically going to be talking about the novel technologies and not foods like beans, pulses and the like. Pretty much everyone agrees that beans are a good thing, and there isn't a lot of controversy, so we don't want to spend time focusing on this. There's clearly a lot of work to be done to push them to get to be more acceptable and more taken up, but that would be a different event. So we're going to start with 3 very short presentations from each of the panelists before opening up to a discussion, which will take us through to the hour, leaving about 30 minutes for Q&A. And if you have a question, please post it in the Q&A, not in the chat section of the Zoom. So that's it for now. I'm going to hand over to Yadira, who hopefully will be sharing her screen.
Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Good, perfect. Thank you so much, Tara. As Tara mentioned, I'm Yadira, and I'm the Director of Responsible Research and Innovation in Canada at New Harvest. And I'm really, really excited to be here today. So to start, I want to tell you a little bit about New Harvest. So for those that are not familiar with our organization, we are a nonprofit founded in 2004, and we are a global organization based in the Netherlands, Canada, and the US. And really our work for the past 2 decades has been to support the groundbreaking research for cellular agriculture. We want this research to be open and accessible to anyone. And we've also been looking into finding ways for sectors and disciplines to collaborate and coordinate activities. And another thing that we are really interested in is in the development and governance of this innovative field. So let's start with the definition of cellular agriculture, because this is something that has been evolving through these years that it has been in development. So for New Harvest, what we define as cellular agriculture is the production of food and other agricultural products using cell cultures. And these cell cultures can be microbial, algae, plant, insect, or animal cells, and it often involves the use of a bioreactor. So I'm just going to explain briefly what cellular agriculture is, the technology itself. So the way that, as I was mentioning, we divided into 2 main technologies, tissue engineering and fermentation. So when we talk about fermentation, we're also considering biomass and precision fermentation. And what we use here are microorganisms that will be our tiny factories that will produce specific organic molecules that we want. And it can be flavors, fats, proteins, sweeteners, you name it. And then when we talk about biomass, we are using these bacteria or these microorganisms. It can also be yeast or fungi or microalgae, but these organisms are going to be part of the end product. And normally what we want is to increase that protein content of these new food products that we're going to be developing. Now, the most novel technology, or people consider it the most interesting or exciting one, is that tissue engineering piece, where we are taking small samples of tissue from an animal, and then we're isolating some of the cells that we want, and then we're going to grow them in a bioreactor with all the nutrients that these cells need so that they can replicate. And then once we have a mass of these cells, we're going to harvest them and use them to produce the final product, which can be a burger or a chicken nugget. And what we consider like a holy grail will be like that steak with the marbling fat that sometimes we see on the pictures. So this is really just a brief overview of the technologies. There's a lot of nuance that goes into producing these products. But then I really want to focus on the state of the industry. So let's see what's going on with cellular agriculture. So I really wanted to start with this graph. Some people like it, some others don't really like it, but I find it really useful to explain how we've been seeing the evolution of cellular agriculture. So this is the Gardner hype cycle, and it's a conceptual graph that really helps us understand the phases of emerging technologies life cycle. Okay, so people that have been involved in the field of cellular agriculture might remember the early stages when there was a lot of hype, and we call it the peak of inflated expectations. There was a lot of interest in these new technologies. There was a lot of investments and a lot of buzz around these. And what happened is that a lot of companies started talking about potential dates where products will be coming to market, and that was causing a lot of hype in the sector. So what happened afterwards? It was great to see a lot of this investment, and a lot of this investment was coming from the private the private sector, VCs. However, there was also a lot of siloing because companies were really protective of their IP. And also there wasn't a lot of pre-competitive research happening. So a lot of this innovation was happening like under the companies, and there was not a lot of information available about this sector. So we saw a lot of lack of collaboration that was really preventing the de-risking of the field. And what we also saw was companies that were vertically integrated. So they were focusing on everything from developing cells all the way to the final product. So I feel that this is when the bubble burst, what happened is that we went through this through of disillusionment. And what happened was that I feel there were pros and cons of going all the way to that through of disillusionment. Because venture capitals and investors started to see that products were not coming to market. The promises that companies have were not fulfilled. So what we started to see was a decrease in private investment, and also a lot of skepticism that started to be built. But also what we started noticing was also an increase in public funding, especially in the field of precision fermentation. And also we started seeing more collaborative initiatives, but in the academic side, where we started seeing hubs and consortia built around the world. So what I think we are going out of the true of disillusionment and hopefully to the slope of enlightenment, where we are starting to see companies shifting their business models to a more B2B business model, where companies are starting to collaborate among each other, and instead of focusing on the whole supply chain. We're also starting to see more pragmatic approaches. For example, the hybrid models, where companies are developing some cell cultures, but at the same time combining it with some plant-based ingredients, and seeing more industry collaboration also with academia. And really trying to adjust the expectations that we're not going to have, for example, culture meat in the short term, but it's more a long-term technology. Okay, so I just want to quickly say, where do we feel New Harvest can contribute? I really feel that technologies like cellular agriculture are neither positive nor negative. Like I feel that technology itself is really a neutral thing that we can use. And people, we all as developers, policymakers, consumers, citizens, are the ones that are going to decide where do we want this technology to go, either to the positive side or the negative side. The positive side, we feel that with good governance models, we can help these technologies be more decentralized and help us bring food to places where it is scarce or not easily accessible, especially with climate change. We can also democratize ownership. And sometimes we talk about the case of the handcrafted brewery, where there's a community built around these, and there's a lot of sharing of knowledge. We can free up farming land, and we can develop new models to incentivize new financing models or business models. But if we go to the negative side, these technologies could help us concentrate some power and wealth only into a couple of companies. And we've seen a lot of that in the food industry, and I wouldn't want to see that also with the cell sector. I can promote IP protection, offer less environmental or nutritional benefits, and all of this still needs a lot of research that needs to happen in order to prove this, or disrupt the local communities and practices. So what we really want to achieve, or what we envision with the work that New Harvest does in collaboration with partners, is that we can have ongoing, open, and inclusive innovation and discourse. And events like these are really helpful for that. Really establish systems of accountability and transparency, for example, through standard development. And really advance a safe product to market. Safety and regulatory approvals are also really relevant. So I'll be happy to talk more about during that discussion. So I'll leave it up there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's just move on to Helen now.
Can you see my screen okay?
Yes.
Great, thank you very much. So I just want to provide a bit of background information about the Good Food Institute Europe and how we view alternative proteins. So the Good Food Institute Europe is part of an international network of nonprofits and think tanks, all under the umbrella of the Good Food Institute, otherwise known as GFI. And our aim is to support the entire sustainable protein sector, specifically by diversifying protein production, because we think there are many benefits that alternative proteins can bring. And our work focuses on three key areas. We have a science team, and that's responsible for developing open access research and resources, building collaborations and networking between researchers, scientists, and entrepreneurs, and funding open access research to help enable breakthroughs in the field. We have a policy team, and they work with policymakers to advocate for public investment into open access research, support for alternative protein infrastructure to help the sector scale up, and advocate for fair regulatory frameworks for looking at safety and the best way of labeling alternative protein products. And finally, we have the industry team, which I'm part of, and we conduct research and share insights. We aim to make publicly available on our website to give people information into the trends, into the alternative protein market and sector. So, for example, we analyze retail sales trends and we conduct consumer polling. And we aim to make these insights available to the whole sector, not just the largest organizations. And we aim to encourage the industry to adopt alternative proteins and aim to connect with manufacturers, retailers, restaurants, and so on. And you can see in this map that we have a few other branches around the world working in other areas where we think there's a potential for alternative proteins to grow. So at GFI, we have our own definition of what an alternative protein is. We work across three main pillars. The first of these is also the most well established in the market at the moment. This is plant-based food. And by this, we mean foods that are made from plants, but they're specifically designed to mimic the taste, texture, and cooking properties of conventional animal-based products, such as meat, milk, yogurt, cheese, seafood, and so on. And then we have the fermentation cluster, which, as Jadira mentioned, we can split into biomass fermentation, where you're aiming to produce a large amount of protein by fermenting a microbe and then using that as the end product. And you also have precision fermentation, where you're using microbes as a sort of cell factory to produce specific molecules that, for example, are molecularly identical to those you might find in dairy or in eggs. And these molecules will generally be used as a food ingredient that bring a certain functionality to foods, but they don't make up the entire foodstuff themselves. And finally, we have cultivated meat and seafood, and this is where the actual cells, muscle cells or fat cells from a sample of animal tissue are taken and then grown in a bioreactor. And the intention here is to produce products that can really closely mimic the nutritional profile and the taste and texture of animal-based foods. But although plant-based foods are not the discussion of the main focus point of today's webinar, they're still relevant because there's often a case for making hybrid products. For example, if you take a food that has mostly plant-based ingredients, but you're using, say, cultivated fat cells to add flavor, that's one way of using cultivated proteins or fat at a very low level, but getting the functionality from them. Or similarly, you could take an ingredient from precision fermentation, add that to a plant-based food to get the color or texture. So even though we're focusing on fermentation and cultivated proteins today, the aspects around plant-based foods and say their health benefits are still also relevant to the discussion. And just to share a bit about how GFI Europe views alternative proteins and their potential benefits, our theory of change is that most people don't want to change what they eat. People like meat, people like dairy, and only a small amount of people will necessarily want to cut out all of those foods from their diets. So we see alternative proteins as providing the same foods that people love, but in a more sustainable way. And luckily, we see that there are many potential benefits that alternative proteins can bring. For example, we believe that they can boost food security, both globally and more locally. For example, demand for meat globally is going up, and we want people to be able to eat as much protein as they like, but if that can be done in a more environmentally sustainable way, that will avoid more of the damage that might be caused by attempting to produce large amounts of conventional meat using intensive industrial livestock methods of production. And there's also a potential for, say, fermentation to be used within localized supply chains, for example, by upcycling side streams from crop production into food ingredients. And we believe that with these more localized supply chains, this can help to enhance the food security and food sovereignty within Europe and encourage resilience, whereas global supply chains can be somewhat fragile. We also have done studies that show the alternative protein sector could create a lot of skilled jobs and thus strengthen economies. And the various sorts of alternative proteins can also have the potential to be produced with lower emissions of gases that cause climate change. We've also done a study showing that some adoption of alternative proteins within Europe could free up a lot of farmland, and then that could be used in a number of ways, but this could include expanding the amount of nature-friendly farming that is a bit more extensive, for example, organic or agroecological. So we see these as complementary. Alternative proteins can enable more nature-friendly farming methods. There's also a potential for protecting public health, whether that's through some of the advantages that the plant-based ingredients can bring, such as higher fiber content. It could also be through reducing the risk of diseases that might originate from intensive livestock agriculture, and also reducing the need for antimicrobials and the resistance that can arise to those. I will hand back over to Tara now. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. So finally, handing over to Tom.
Great, thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen. Let me know when you can see it. Sorry, it's just taking a while to load. That's not working, so I will share my whole screen. Let's try that. Can you see that?
Yeah, we can.
Great. So I am going to, sorry, what's the first slide? So I'm just going to talk briefly about the role of the Food Standards Agency. As Tara introduced me, I'm the Deputy Director of Innovation at the UK Food Standards Agency, which is the regulator of food safety for England, Wales and Northern Ireland. And I'm going to talk a little bit about novel foods regulation, because quite a few of the alternative proteins we've mentioned on the call so far fall within the regulatory framework for novel foods in the UK. But just to start off, I'm going to explain what the Food Standards Agency does. So our mission is food you can trust. So that means that food is safe, food is what it says it is, and food is healthier and more sustainable. And our job in the Food Standards Agency is to safeguard public health. So we're very much here for the consumer to make sure that their interests in relation to food and also animal feed are protected. We are an independent government department. We're transparent and we're led by science and evidence. And as I say, we represent across consumers across England, Northern Ireland and Wales, and we work very closely with our colleagues in Food Standards Scotland that represent Scottish interests. So what are novel foods? Well, in terms of regulation, so any food that was basically not used for human consumption to a significant degree within the UK before 1997 is what we call a novel food. And therefore, these types of new foods need regulatory approval before they can be sold in Great Britain. And you'll see a similar framework is in place across Europe and the EU, and other countries have sort of similar elements and similar sort of approaches to novel foods globally, obviously varying by different countries. When we talk about novel foods in the UK context, we're talking about a very broad breadth of products, right from entirely new foods. So for example, some of the plant sterols that are included in low cholesterol spreads, traditional foods that are eaten elsewhere in the world that haven't been eaten in the UK before, but then also these more innovative foods produced from entirely new processes, such as precision fermentation, cell-cultivated products, and other things that we've talked about on the call so far. When it comes to novel foods, it's the FSA's job to make sure that novel foods are not dangerous to consumers, that they don't mislead consumers, and they can't be nutritionally disadvantageous to consumers versus the product they're intending to replace. And so these are the core elements of our regulatory framework that we ensure through our process. But we don't just look at safety. So safety is our key elements that we advise upon, but we also look at what we call other legitimate factors when we make a regulatory decision. And those will vary depending on the food and on the specific characteristics of that food. But when we're thinking about a novel food, this can include things like consumer interests, so things like impact on the environment, animal welfare, food security. It can include our understanding of consumer habits and what consumer perceptions about a certain type of food might be and their preferences and how that needs to impact how we regulate. We also think about the economic impact, so the cost and benefits of the regulation we're proposing. And we also try and think about delivery on the ground. So, for example, how enforceable is the regulation? How will it work in practice? What happens if the technology moves on? How does the regulation need to move on with it? And then I just wanted to summarize a couple of our programs that are really focused on the alternative protein space, both in terms of novel foods. So first of all, we have launched what we call a regulatory sandbox on cell-cultivated products. So that's cultivated meat. And that's essentially a forum in which we're working very closely with a subset of companies, trade bodies, and non-governmental organizations to understand the production processes behind these products and to help us identify the key questions we need to answer in order to regulate them and to ensure that they are safe. And that's a program I'm happy to talk more about if there are questions or if there's a chance in the panel discussion. And then the other program that we currently have running in the Food Standards Agency is a recently launched program called our Innovation Research Program that focuses on precision fermentation, which is the technology that's already been mentioned on the call, where engineered microbes are used to produce foods. And that program is looking to increase our scientific and policy capability to assess those specifically, those products, but also provide more efficient regulatory decisions for businesses and more transparency about the regulatory requirements of this new type of technology. And so I'll leave it there, and we can pick up more of this in the conversation, hopefully.
Thank you very much. Thank you, all of them. So, all of you, rather. Tom, I'm just going to start with a question for you. In your, I think, penultimate slide, you talked about sort of thinking about not just the kind of physical safety of certain products, but things like consumer interest and economic impact. So can I just clarify that when you talk about the economic impact, do you mean how much it would cost you to regulate, or what the potential economic benefits are to the country?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So we interpret that quite broadly. So our role is to basically provide advice to ministers in the UK who make the ultimate decision about whether to approve a product. And so if we think evidence on either the economic benefit of the product or the cost of the regulation we're proposing to apply would be relevant to a minister making that decision, we will present that to them. So we don't just tell them, you know, it's safe. We also say these are the other considerations you might want to think about, minister, before approving, and you will want to satisfy yourself that we have a sensible regulatory position on.
And when it comes to the whole consumer interest and thinking about the well-being of not just present but future generations, how much pressure is there on you to kind of extend your definition of what safety actually means?
So I think we're quite clear on safety for us is public health impact and on human health. But yeah, we do take into account these wider factors. I mean, like I said, we also do represent Wales, which has a specific act on future generations that we need to take into account, for example. So yeah, that all forms part of a holistic assessment that we try to provide to ministers.
Thank you. Helen, I have a question for you. Can you say a little bit about public attitudes to these foods? And yeah, what the latest, and of course it's quite hard because some of these foods are not possible to be eaten yet. So can
That's
you say a
exactly
little
the
more?
difficulty.
Yeah,
That's because while plant-based food is widely available in Europe, cultivated meat is not. And although some precision fermentation ingredients are already widely used in Europe, for example, rennet and citric acid, these are not things that are typically tasted on their own. So most people are forming their opinions of cultivated or fermented proteins based on media narratives, social media, or what they've read about it, rather than actually having tasted it. So that makes the research quite theoretical, quite abstract, and it's difficult to know how attitudes are going to change over time and how much they will have changed by the time these products actually come to market. That said, we have done some polling on acceptance of cultivated meat across 15 European countries, and this was conducted together with YouGov. And that showed that quite a lot of people have heard of cultivated meat. It varied from 23% to 61%, with the highest proportion being found in the Netherlands. And generally, the Northern European countries are more likely to have heard of cultivated meat, but not many people actually say that they know a lot about it. It was only up to 21% of people said that they know a lot about cultivated meat. So it is still very new, and I think people don't really know how to judge it and how to make judgments about it when they haven't tasted it. That said, in this survey, we did find a lot of support for cultivated meat being made available for sale if it's found to be safe by the regulators, the food safety regulators. This ranged from, sorry, let me find the right figure, 48 to 69% of people believe that cultivated meat should be made available for sale if it's approved by the food safety regulators. And just to be clear, this is talking about EU food regulation rather than the UK process. It's a different one. Although the EU process does also allow for holistic factors such as social, cultural, and economic to be brought in, as well as the scientific assessment of the safety and nutritional aspects. The highest level of support that we found was in Portugal, although awareness was not particularly high there, but there was a lot of support. So it's interesting to see the difference in awareness versus support.
any
Quite a
idea
lot.
why?
I think it might be that maybe if there hasn't been a particularly strong sort of entrenchment of narratives in the media in some countries yet, it might be that people are just forming their own opinions over the course of the survey.
Right.
We found that a lot of people were willing to try cultivated meat at least once. This ranged from 35% to 63% at the most. This was highest in Portugal, Czechia, the Netherlands, and Spain. But fewer people said that they would like to replace some of the meat that they currently eat with cultivated meat. Again, highest in the Netherlands. But we did find that a lot of people think that current conventional meat consumption is too high, and a lot of people do want to reduce their meat consumption. But the question is, are the alternatives going to be good enough? Will they taste enough? Taste good enough? Will they be affordable? Will they be convenient? When it comes to precision fermentation, we have some research that shows around half of consumers in France, Germany, Spain, and the UK are already open to trying precision fermentation, egg and dairy. But I think there's a real gap in understanding. We find that a lot of people don't know exactly what precision or cultivated products are, and there needs to be some level of background information provided. But we find it can't be too little, and it also can't be too much. Lengthy explanations that are highly technical or scientific can put people off.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just one very quick follow-up question, then I'd like to get on to Jadira. Motivations, did they cite any reasons either for perhaps their support for at least trying these alternative proteins other than just curiosity, and their comments on meat?
Well, we did some polling that looked into people's reasons for reducing meat and dairy consumption, and the primary drivers were cost, taste, and health.
Okay.
But these don't necessarily translate into actively choosing the fermented or cultivated options. There are some studies show that people look positively on potential environmental benefits or health or safety when they're considering these novel products. But I think people are often just not entirely sure what to make of it and might not have a clear idea of what would drive them to choose it or not choose it.
Thanks, Helen. So Jadira, I mean, in your presentation, I guess I've got two questions for you. In your presentation, you highlighted some of the positive things that you thought these products could offer the world, but you also highlighted some of the risks, which was the kind of entrenchment of existing unequal power structures. Can you say a bit more about that? And in particular, so say a bit more and see where you feel the mood is, the trends are going in this sort of what you might call more hopeful, democratized, decentralized approach, as opposed to this more kind of entrenched system. And then connected to that, can you reflect a bit on what you feel the role of the state is on influencing the evolution of this sector?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And as I mentioned, I think what we've seen with a decrease in private investment has been like a switch also in the approach that the industry is moving towards these new technologies. For example, I feel that some of the lessons learned has been that more openness and more collaboration is needed. And the creation of these centers, for example, the Bezos centers in different countries, where companies can collaborate with academics to address some of the biggest challenges that we've seen in the sector. I think that's a positive thing that we've seen, because I feel with these new collaborations, it's easier to develop knowledge that can help the whole sector as a whole, and not only a few companies. So I think that's something positive that we've seen as this technology is moving forward. We've also heard stories of companies that are trying to come together. For example, a company might be developing cell lines, and another company might be working on growth media, and they are trying to collaborate to actually find ways to solve some of the challenges in scaling up, or things that are preventing a single company to advance. So I think that's also something positive that we've seen, like more openness and collaboration between the different companies. I feel that the public support is key, because I don't think that we can leave all of these to the private sector and private investments. We need also the public support to de-risk some of these technologies. Cellular agriculture, especially culture meat, I feel is really research intensive, and it requires a lot of funding to actually move things forward. And I feel that's where public support could play a role. For example, one of the things that we've noticed is key, at least in the Canadian side, is access to infrastructure for scaling up. We don't have a lot of these places where companies can have access to thousands of liters bioreactors. And these are things that are really expensive for only one small startup to fund. So here is where public funding could come into play. Like, can we develop or can we establish more shared facilities where small startups can have access to this equipment that they need to scale up? So I've seen that in some countries we're starting to see the development of those kind of facilities, but we need more of them, because I understand right now from some startups in Canada that this is really challenging to have access to these, and sometimes the waiting list can be really long. And if we want these technologies to reach market, we need to have more of these support and more of these facilities and infrastructure that can be helpful.
And in terms of sort of, I guess, a question from you to Tom, what do you need from regulators that would help this sector do its job effectively and safely, and with consideration to this broader complex of concerns?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. I think there's different aspects where we can see the government playing a role here. One, as Tom was mentioning, is safety, but I think also there's a lot that can be done in terms of policies in how the funding is distributed. Or again, these are some things that I see on the Canadian side. How do we support innovation? Sometimes the funding models that are established, maybe they support only one stage of the innovation pathway, not all of it. Sometimes there are gaps that exist, and it's different when we talk about technologies that are research intensive, like cellular agriculture, than other emerging technologies like software, for example, or primary agriculture also is different than cellular agriculture. The food and beverage sector there's also some nuances, and I feel cellular agriculture still doesn't have a home when we talk about funding opportunities. Which is the agency that is going to be involved in supporting this? This is in the case of Canada, this is the agricultural agency, or is it the innovation, or is it where does cellular agriculture fits? So I think there's still a lot of questions in terms of how do we support the sector from an innovation perspective, from a regulatory perspective as well, and research as well.
Can I just
Tom,
jump in?
Yes, go ahead.
And so at GFI Europe, we're thinking about many similar issues, and I think in a very similar way. We see that there are some things that require a high level of investment. For example, if you want to build a commercial scale plant. And we've also been looking at these strategic partnerships between larger companies that have the resources and the smaller startups that have the innovation. And my colleague Ellen has also been looking at innovative financing mechanisms, as you say, to help de-risk some of the issues, and also supporting the open access research. So I think we're coming at this from a very similar angle here.
Tom, do you want to say a little bit about the UK's approach to thinking about investment and all the rest of it in the UK?
Yeah, I can sort of expand on what the other panelists have mentioned. So I think we do a lot of dialogue with companies. That's kind of key to us, is understanding what companies need to have regulatory certainty, and what they tell us, especially through the sandbox I mentioned, is the key things are certainty and transparency. So what regulations will apply and when, so that they can make sensible decisions ahead of time. So these are things like, how does scale up work? So I said that we grant approvals for novel foods. What if the technology has changed? What if in scale up the production process is altered? Does that mean they have to get a separate approval? Can they update their current approval? So it's questions like that they will have. And what we do is we host these sort of regular workshops through this regulatory sandbox to tease out those questions and understand, well, what do we need to answer as a regulator to create that certainty for business, whilst also keeping consumers safe. And then beyond what the FSA is doing, like I say, it's very focused on food safety. The UK government is also investing in this space. So it's through UK government grants that we've been able to do some of the work we've done on alternative proteins. I know that the UK research, UKRI in the UK, and also Innovate UK, who are research funders, have invested a lot of research money into this area, which is obviously public money. So there has been a sort of flow through of public investment as well into the research that underpins this.
And do you know the balance between government funding versus kind of private sector funding? Do you know how the numbers stack up there?
I think the private sector funding, from what I understand, is significantly more than the public funding, which you might expect. Just because in the UK, at least, we have seen quite a lot of investment from the private sector into these particular technologies, which I think is the reason for the balance there. Because we see sort of quite a significant investment in both precision fermentation and cell-cultivated products from industry. But we've also seen several sort of millions of pounds worth of grants given out to alternative protein research as well. So it seems to be a good combination that is working in the UK.
Thank you. Did either of you want to come in on that at all, on this question of the balance of funding? No, okay. I just wanted to turn to something that I think Helen touched upon, which was employment. And I mean, I think some of the fears are that these, the food sector is a massive employer, and there are definitely fears that that the development of these foods will be at the expense of particularly jobs in the farming sector. Can you say a little bit more about what, and I know we will return to this in another two webinars, particularly perhaps on the one on environment, but can you just say a bit about what you think the opportunities are there?
Yes. So I don't have the studies to hand. We have done some studies on job creation and so on. I can send these over later for the follow-up paper. I think in general, the perception that alternative proteins are potentially damaging to farmers is a key one. People care about it. We found in our polling, people want policymakers to help farmers benefit from any of the advantages that alternative proteins might produce, whether that's actually actively producing feedstocks for fermentation processes, or whether it's that the freeing up of land that had previously been used for, say, animal feed could instead be used for more extensive forms of agriculture, which could include livestock production as well, for example, in agroecological systems, because we see alternative proteins and livestock as complementary. We think there's a role for both in the world. But it's also possible that there will be new jobs created outside of the farming sector in these new alternative protein sectors, whether that's in the production plants or in the research or in other parts of the supply chain. So people do care about ensuring that people aren't disadvantaged too strongly. I think there's going to be a mixture of opportunities for farmers, for non-farmers. I think Yadira would like to come in.
Yes, I just want to add that I feel it's really important to start these conversations earlier with the players in that conventional ag sector, and really start engaging with them to understand what are the concerns that they have, and what are the things that what do they feel this could be a potential threat, for example. And I feel there's still a lot of opportunities to do that, and to understand how can we help make this transition as easy as possible for everyone. I feel this is going to be, at least if we think about culture meat, it's going to be a really long-term thing that we can do, and really understanding what impact that technology could have in the livelihoods of people involved in the conventional ag would be really important. I know like policies could also be really helpful in doing this. Are there any types of incentives that could be developed? But I also feel there's a lot of research that needs to happen. I really like what Helen mentioned about, can we use some of the side streams or some of the crops that are grown in some regions to serve as feedstocks for cellular agriculture processes. And that's, for example, a project we have in Canada, like trying to connect and bridge the gap between the conventional ag sector and cellular agriculture through the development of potential supply chains. But what are those ingredients? Are they actually feasible? Are they actually more sustainable? So I think there's still a lot of questions that need to happen, but that's also something that we need to start thinking about, and not only about the end product itself.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, when you talk about feedstocks and conventional agriculture, I mean, I guess there's two reflections to think about there. So one is, I guess there can be fears that in making more cost effective some of these, put it monocultural, very homogeneous sorts of production systems, by making them more cost effective, you are kind of propping them up in a way that perhaps moves away from the idea of a transition. I think that was kind of one of the comments I wanted to raise or ask you to about. And then connected to that, would it just sort of grow the overall volume of production without actually changing the balance of sorts of foods being consumed? I wonder if anyone had any thoughts on that. Oh, Tom.
Yeah, the only thing I would add, and it's not from our position as the Food Standards Agency, but it's more what we hear from companies in terms of the sort of justification in the future of these technologies is, we're going to see a huge increase in the global population. So there is increased demand that these technologies could nominally meet. So it's not necessarily replacing things that already exist. It's about meeting that increased demand.
Right. I mean, in terms of farmers, I know that for example, in the UK, the Royal Agricultural University has done some sort of stakeholder engagement work with farmers and really try to sort of get help to try and understand from farmers what they feel their concerns and what the opportunities might be. But I wonder if you could say, perhaps, Helen, if you can, a bit more about where you see, if at all, there to be synergies between the development of these cell-cultivated proteins and the traditional livestock sector.
A couple of ways. It could be that the overall volume of traditional livestock production goes down, but then it goes towards the more premium, high-end sort of products. So that these could be really high quality grass-fed, but sort of eaten as a special occasion. And this is also in line with suggestions from, for example, the Sustainable Food Trust, which did modelling and suggested lower levels of meat production, but they want to look at high quality. So it could be that some people's protein consumption could be a mixture of this lower levels of animal sourced meat and dairy, some level of the conventional beans, tofu, and so on. Also the plant-based options, but also then the novel cultivated or fermented proteins. The way we see it is as protein production needs to be diversified. We see a role for multiple different sorts of production, and that could be in terms of the type of land that they're using. For example, there could be some room for grass-fed livestock. It could be that crops, instead of being used as animal feed, are then used as feedstocks for cultivation, fermentation, or cultivation. Or they could also go into use as plant-based meat, which can be quite a nutrient-dense form of vegetarian protein, especially if it's fortified with certain vitamins and minerals. Yeah, the other aspect I think is the using of side streams from, say, processing of food or crop production. This could turn potentially non-edible side streams that might otherwise go into waste into and then they'd be upcycled into edible forms of protein. I had another point, but it's gone.
Okay. Um, just one question, and this actually taps into a question that has come from the audience. It's about the terms meat and milk. I mean, the question really is, there's been a lot of discussion and much friction from traditional industries about terms such as meat and milk, and that they should be retained by and protected for animal-based variants. Do you have any thoughts about how important there is and how to manage? And I guess maybe it's not one for you, Tom, but it is for the Advertising Standards Authority. I mean, do you have any
Yeah,
idea?
no, it's a really good question and one that we grapple with as well. So it is for us because our other job is to make sure that food is what it says it is. So labeling needs to be clear to the consumer and they need to know what they're eating. So we would expect any food to be really crystal clear what is contained within it. And so what we do is when we grant a regulatory approval, for example, we set the conditions on labeling. So that can have a big effect. And obviously, you've talked about, milk, whether you can call it milk, whether you can call it meat. Those are really important questions. The other things that companies really look for is the certainty to know how that impacts regulation. So are these things technically meat and therefore fall under meat regulation? Are they technically animal products, which is a slightly different type of regulation. That's the kind of question we need to answer as a regulator.
Yeah.
Can I add?
Yes, please do.
One thing that we think is really important is that consumers need to be able to understand if they're allergic to dairy, for example. They need to be able to understand that they can't have precision fermentation dairy proteins because they are molecularly the same. So we do see a role for calling things meat and dairy to help people understand what products these new things are aiming to replace or mimic or provide an alternative to. It's really important that people understand what it is that they're looking at, and they need to be able to make their own judgments on whether it's okay for them to eat it.
So another question that comes from actually Anna Beckett. She says, thank you for the interesting presentations. I work for ScienceWise, a UKRI funded programme which co-funds public dialogue on emerging science and technology. Do the panel feel there would be value in doing I guess she means public dialogue around alternative proteins? And to add to that question, do you have examples of any other such more public citizen dialogues that have happened in other parts of the world?
I can do, like, I do feel these kind of opportunities to bring different stakeholders together are really relevant. You mentioned the work that the Royal Agricultural University did to try to understand, and they work with some farmers, and I think those are the kind of things that are really important to start these discussions, even though the technology is really far away. It's good to know what they what their role could be, or why they could be interested or concerned about these novel technologies, and start thinking about opportunities where there can be a bridge between adopting emerging technologies like cellular agriculture and traditional agriculture. I really feel conventional ag is more than just producing food, and for a lot of people it's really a lifestyle, and there's a lot that is involved in that. So we really need to make sure to understand how can we do a transition that is as fair and just as possible for all the different players in the supply chain. And I think for this kind of dialogue is really relevant to have not only conventional players, but policymakers and academics as well, to really understand the gaps that exist and how can we fill those gaps. And I think there's a lot of lessons that we can learn from the energy transition, for example, and see what are the things that we could apply for these, like a protein transition that we're towards to.
Thanks. Tom, you got your hand up.
Yes, I was just going to add to that. I think from a regulatory point of view, we really care about what consumers think. So any public dialogue that expands that evidence base is obviously really helpful. We wouldn't necessarily lead it as a regulator, but would support wider industry or academia looking to do more of this, because consumer acceptance is both going to be key for these products being sold, but also does influence how we regulate. If we think consumers are concerned about something, it's our job to make sure they have all the information they need. So that kind of research is really helpful in shaping how we regulate.
And I mean, when it comes to public dialogue, and I just want to jump in, what do you see the role of dialogue to be and to what extent would government form decisions on the basis of those dialogue processes? To what extent would it inform those decisions, as opposed to it being a process where I guess the aim is to increase consumer acceptability, which is actually a very different thing altogether?
Yes, I think it does inform it. Like I said, in the case of the UK and also I believe in the EU, it's politicians and political structures that make the final decision. So obviously we care very much what the public think. So it does matter, and you'll see in areas like this where you have a really innovative technology, you'll get decision makers asking more questions than you would normally get. So on a routine novel food, you probably say it's safe, that's good enough, it'll get approved. On something like this, there will be questions raised by decision makers about all the questions we're talking about here. And so the more evidence we have to give them to help them make a decision, the better.
Thanks. So I've got a question here from Martin Rowe, quite a special, a sort of specific question. Could panelists discuss non-animal derived alternatives to fetal bovine serum in current or future cultivated meat products, and whether and how IP restrictions may or may not be hindering wider availability of those cultivated meat products? I guess it's a two-part question. Would somebody like to focus on the serum question?
I can jump in if so. I think there's been a lot of research in trying to substitute FBS or the fetal bovine serum in processes. I feel one of the goals of developing these novel products is to for them to be animal free, and having FBS doesn't really meet with that vision that producers and consumers are looking for on cultivated meat. I think there's been some research. What it's been trying to do is how can we use, for example, side streams? And a clear example is canola meal as an alternative for FBS in these processes. So there's, I think, researchers from Tufts University that have been working on this alternative. And I think that's where this bridge or this connection with agriculture could play a role in trying to find substitutes for ingredients that maybe right now are that right now are animal derived, like FBS, or also ingredients that might be really expensive, like some amino acids, for example, in the processes as well. Again, there still needs to be a research on this area and really understand if this is scalable, but those are opportunities for things that could be done. In terms of IP, I feel because a lot of this initial research was done by companies, there's not a lot of a lot of public information around what companies are being using in their growth media. Some companies might be claiming that they are completely animal free, but we might not know what they are actually using because that information is not publicly available. So I feel that's where more public support for research that can be openly accessible for everyone is really important to really figure out how these formulations have been developed as well. And consortia where companies are working or collaborating with academia could be also really relevant because that can be a way of where information can be anonymized or information can be shared without compromising some of the IP that companies are having, for example.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, does anyone have any more to add on that point? Just want to ask another question about, again, is public funding, and I can see totally the argument. I also hear arguments that some people make. So the one argument is obviously that we need more investment in government investment in these technologies in order to avoid some of the problems caused by the kind of corporate, private, entrenched sort of all the problems that you've just expressed. But the counter argument to that is, if government is going to be investing large amounts of taxpayers' money, maybe it should be investing it in products that perhaps are more traditionally acceptable, like beans and pulses, and getting people to consume those foods. So I guess this is a question for you, Helen, because GFI's, as you pointed out, its theory of change is founded on or based on the idea that people just aren't going to change far enough, fast enough. I mean, can you say a bit more there?
Yes, I mean, we totally think beans are valid. Beans are great, but we see that most people, when they're making decisions about what food to eat, as a general rule, they're considering taste, price, convenience. Do they know how to cook it? Does it match up with their nutritional health and fitness goals? For example, if they want to build a lot of muscle, do they get the protein they need? Or if they're trying to lose weight, is it matching up with that? But taste and price always come up as the top factors. And yes, a lot of people do care about other more broad factors in society. If they take a step back and are thinking, do they care about the environment, climate change, nature restoration? people do often care about these, but they're just generally not high on the list of priorities when actual food decisions are being made. So we do aim to support products that are going to be easy for people to swap into their diets, that preferably have some benefit for, say, health as well. There's always going to be a small segment of consumers that are heavily driven by environmental, animal welfare, or just curiosity for new foods. But we really want people to be drawn towards these products for the reasons that feel most natural to them, which it always comes down to taste and price. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Although, of course, it raises lots more because I'm already channeling some further questions that people have about you. But you mentioned the kind of building muscle and the focus on proteins, and of course, we do know that as soon as you term something alternative proteins, and I am well aware that you're also exploring like fats and other food ingredient, food nutrients, but we live in a country, and I guess most of the investment is occurring within countries where there is not a protein shortage and where there has been kind of paradoxically, the less of a shortage there is, the more of a focus there is on proteins. And these, of course, alternative proteins sort of entrench the idea of protein being this food in short supply. And I'm also thinking, I think a comment that you made, Tom, which was, and we have actually, just a quick plug, we have written a little bit on the cultural history of protein, which I think we can post in the chat. But I just also wanted to pick up on your point, Tom, on the question that obviously the population, the global population is growing and we will need these foods. I guess so can you speak to questions of protein and whose responsibility is it to feed the world and some of the, I guess, historical and cultural baggage that comes with phrases of that nature? Answers on a postcard, please. Who can go first? Go on, Jadira, I feel sure that you can say something.
Yeah, well, I would have to agree first with Thomas about I feel we need all the different tools that we can have right now to address the issue of mostly of climate change. We know that as the population grows, we're not going to have more land to keep producing the proteins the way that we've been doing it throughout these years. So I feel we really need to find different ways to keep providing the proteins and the food in general that we will need for an increasing population. And I feel cellular agriculture by itself is not a silver bullet. And we know it's not a perfect technology. There's still years to go to have like the perfect steak that people are wanting. But this can be only one alternative or one solution that we can pursue while we also continue improving or working on regenerative agriculture or other trying to mitigate the production of methane from cattle or other options that we know we're more advanced. In that sense, I feel, for example, when we talk alternative proteins, we're trying to say that this is gonna be instead of something else. And I honestly don't feel it's like that. I feel it's as Thomas was also saying, it's just a complementary technology or a complementary way of producing the food that we're going to need. So yeah, I think it's just the way that we phrase it, and also the point that we need different things, especially with climate change going so affecting us so much, and the agricultural sector itself.
Helen, you had your hand up first.
Yeah, so this question of whether alternative protein is just going to be adding on to more protein. We did some polling on, it was more to do with plant-based protein, but we divided people into people who wanted to eat more, people who wanted to eat less meat and dairy, and then also cross-reference that with people who wanted to eat more plant-based protein. And we found about half of people don't want to change their diet, but then it was roughly equally split between people who just want to cut meat and dairy, and then people who just want to eat more plant-based, and then people who want to do both. They want to cut meat and dairy and they want to eat more plants. And we found that each of these segments is driven by different motivations. So the people who just want more protein overall, which includes plant-based, they tended to be male. They tended to be more driven by high protein, high fiber, looking to build muscle. But people who are wanting to eat more plants, but also less meat and dairy, they are more likely to be driven by the environment, animal welfare, or if they had health goals, it was more likely to be weight loss. So we find that I think there's a case of all of this happening. There might be some replacement or substitution, but there might be some addition on top. There might just be people cutting out meat and dairy just for the sake of it.
Thank you. That's interesting. Tom.
Yeah, it's just to come back to something we were discussing a bit earlier that links to this question of sort of the complex societal questions the technology poses. And we were talking about the potential tension with traditional agriculture, for example. I think it's the case that maybe in the Netherlands, they're building a cultivated meat production facility on a farm to try and demonstrate that sort of traditional agriculture can be a part of this technological revolution. So there are some interesting things going on that are trying to bridge this gap, or this perceived gap between the two. But it's quite interesting to follow and see how that builds into the public narrative on these technologies.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, if you could send us the link to it and we can include it in the notes after this event, that would be really helpful. Jadira.
Yeah, and I also wanted to mention another piece, because I feel we also, as food is so cultural, and we can't forget about the developing countries and what's going on there and the different lifestyles that they have. Like I'm from Mexico, and I feel that every time I go down there, like meat is key. We need to have meat there. And people are not always as open to these new technologies as we can imagine. It's not so popular or so common to talk about these technologies yet. So I feel, again, we need all these different alternatives to tackle or to address the different social aspects or cultures if we think about this as a global problem as well.
And can you say anything a bit more about investments in low and middle income countries by people from low and middle income countries and for people from low and middle income countries? I'm just thinking about, you talked about the kind of cultural importance of food, and again, these foods have largely been of the form of sort of burgers and sausages, at least the plant-based alternatives, which some would argue is a form of sort of, I guess, cultural imperialism, McDonaldization of food cultures. Are there any examples of kind of alternative kinds of alternatives?
That's a good question, and I'm not. So I can just tell you some of the things that we've seen with the work at New Harvest. I think most of the work that at least we've been supporting is being more in developed countries. Like I remember I've connected with researchers in South America and Mexico as well that were interested in getting involved in research in alternative proteins, and not only cell-ag, but also plant-based proteins. But there wasn't still enough support for this kind of technologies. And we know in the case of culture meat, for example, it's really research intensive, and the type of equipment and needs that you or consumables or things that you need for that kind of research is not something that you can easily have access to. So I think there were only a few researchers, in this case in Mexico, working on these new technologies, and it was in a private university. So that can tell you more or less about that scenario. So I think that's still not something that we've seen a lot and I'm talking only specifically about Latin America, but we've seen researchers, we've seen interest in getting involved and trying to find ways to get more knowledge, access to knowledge, to to this kind of research. And I feel that's where, again, public research is really important, because that can help start some of these new technologies in universities or places when there's still not a lot of things happening.
Thank you. That's a really interesting comment. I have a question. We've talked a little bit, or rather, Helen, you've talked a bit about sort of consumer public attitudes, but the more specific part of this question from Andres Viardel is, what kind of sensory and consumer studies do you think would be interesting to carry out?
Well, that does depend partly on regulation of what's allowed to be taste tested. We have some sensory data on plant-based meat in various countries. For example, the Nectar study looks at plant-based meat in the US, but it would be interesting to see how that plays out in Europe, for example. But I think fundamentally it comes back to the point I mentioned earlier. People just haven't really tried precision fermentation ingredients or cultivated meat ingredients, and to be able to get feedback on how those compare to animal-based products or their equivalents, and also how the sort of hybrid products, where maybe you've got a low level of cultivated meat or cultivated fat added to the plant-based products, to see how those are accepted in comparison would be interesting to see. But I realise that's not a very detailed answer.
I think that is a really interesting point. So when you're talking about the sort of hybrid products, because I remember visiting a firm here in the UK, and that was what they were thinking of, using these foods in a sort of hybrid form of sort of meat plus alternatives, as well as meat plus as well as alternative proteins and plant proteins. And I'm just wondering, since people's sense of kind of disgust is quite specific, I'm just wondering whether there are any different sort of attitudes towards mixing it with plants versus mixing alternative meat with meat, whether there had been any of that kind of research, at least hypothetical.
So the mixing alternative proteins with conventional meat, we would refer to as a blended product. And I think there's great potential for that, but it also is quite difficult to get the marketing right and figure out exactly who it's being aimed at, because vegetarians and vegans are not going to want to eat it. But then what's the benefit for regular meat eaters to have it? It could be health benefits, added fiber. But when it comes to the hybrid products, yeah, I think there's also a potential for, if you're using, say, cultivated fat to add the flavor to your plant-based ingredient, primarily plant-based ingredient, you might be able to avoid using certain other ingredients that might otherwise add a sort of off note or flavor. Or there's a report by Anthony Warner who's looked into what contributes to the cost of plant-based foods. And when it comes down to it, a lot of the cost comes from the additives and flavorings that are used to really replicate the meat flavoring. So if you could take out those and replace them with cultivated meat, you might, hypothetically, I can't say for certain, but you might be able to get a more authentic flavor and maybe avoid some of the off notes that might come from certain additives. Or it might also potentially be able to reduce some of the cost of those ingredients that are used in small amounts to get the right flavor. But that's hypothetical. I don't actually have the data on it.
Tom, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, I can't talk to the comparison with hybrid products, but when we look at the consumer research we've done in the UK by the FSA, we can see there's more consumer willingness, for example, to try precision fermented dairy and egg than there is cultivated meat. And one of the motivators behind the interest in dairy and egg that's precision fermented is curiosity about taste from consumers. So we know that's one of the drivers that might push them to try these products.
Thank you. So I've got a question here. It's a very big question. To what extent do alternative proteins play in creating a food system that is resilient, i.e. positively contributes to food security, to future shocks, so resilient to future shocks, particularly in relation to food terrorism and the current geopolitical climate? Do you anticipate any vulnerabilities? It's a very big question. Who would like to have a go?
I could start on the food security point. So I think that's, again, this is one of those other factors we think about when we think about what will ministers, what does government care about when it's regulating, and food security is obviously a priority for most governments. And obviously, I mean, in the UK we import a lot of our food, and if you look at countries that have done a lot in the government space to support this sector or promote this sector, for example, Singapore, that is based on a clear kind of drive around food security and making sure they can onshore food production, and reduce reliance on imports. So there is something about within different countries, you'll see food security as one of the drivers for exploring this technology.
Yeah, thanks. Helen.
One of the other ways that alternative proteins might add to resilience is not directly through the food system, but by freeing up areas of land that could be used for nature restoration. And for example, this could reduce the risk of flooding, and that could generally help to make society more resilient and also prevent the flooding from affecting farmlands.
Thanks. Jadira, do you have anything further to add on that? No.
Not really. Well, for example, from the Canadian side, I think the agricultural sector here is key. Like Canada is really one of the big food exporters, especially of a lot of crops. But we also see that these new technologies as a way of improving our supply chains and not be completely dependent on other countries. For example, one right now with all the challenges with the US in the South, for example, a lot of our canola meal it's exported to the US for feed. Are there any ways that canola meal can be used locally to support our supply chains and, as they said, not be completely dependent on the instability that could happen in other countries? So I think there's a lot of opportunities that we could use alternative proteins to develop more localized, decentralized supply chains as well.
I've got a sort of comment here, perhaps not so much a question, from Dina Rosin, who says, I don't think it could be called agriculture. Were alternative names considered? So that's a big question. But regarding designing in flavour, I am also concerned with this formulation requiring ingredients responsible for flavour. My understanding is that nature-produced foods, both meat and produce, manifest flavour when vital nutrients are present. If micronutrients are added in, as in nutrients and vitamins, is bioavailability compatible with traditional foods? Now, we are going to have a whole webinar focused on some of these nutritional questions, but Helen, or does anyone have any comments on that?
I think that's a really interesting point. I don't have a very substantive answer to it, other than we have been looking into the nutritional comparison of as plant-based specifically with animal-based meat, as my colleague Amy Williams is our nutrition lead, and I will try and find a link to the piece that she's written. But I think it's a really interesting point about the flavour in potentially indicating nutrients. I do think there's also a strong case for making sure that alternative proteins, if specifically plant-based, if they don't have the same bioavailable levels of vitamins and nutrients, they should be fortified so that they are nutritionally equivalent.
Okay, thank you. So we have about 5 minutes before we close. I just wanted you all to kind of give an opportunity to say things that you haven't had a chance to say at the moment, say so far. Would anyone like to kind of add their final minute or two of final reflections that you feel you haven't had an opportunity to talk about? Helen.
Something that I wanted to add is that I think consumer perceptions of alternative proteins are really quite fluid, and they it depends so much on how these products are talked about, how they're framed and marketed, the images that are used. There have been a few studies showing that if you talk about the sort of food aspects of cultivated meat, so the taste, the way you can cook it, and you show it being cooked or served or prepared, that's a lot more appealing than some of the depictions that are a bit more common in the media, which are more sort of laboratory based, blue gloves, petri dishes, that's off-putting. But it's the same product and it can have the same benefits. So how you talk about it really matters. So also there was another study that looked at again consumption. So a sort of consumption frame or a production frame, which talks about how cultivated meat is made, or an alternative food framing. And it's the one that focuses on the food aspects that is most appealing. So it's a case of, yes, developing products that meet consumers' needs, but also making sure that those benefits are clearly communicated in a way that resonates with the target audiences.
Thanks, Helen. Tom?
Yeah, I think the only other point from me would be just to encourage people to read the various publications that have been posted in the chat, including some of the consumer work we've already done in the Food Standards Agency. And also I can share, subsequent to this, links to our website that's now got a page all about these kind of products and what we do as a regulator, as well as the new business support service we've launched for companies looking to market these products. We can share those with attendees.
Thank you. Jadira, do you have any final
Yeah,
comments?
I guess just to reiterate the importance of dialogue, honestly, because I feel companies need to understand what consumers want, need to understand what regulators need for getting the product's approval. Consumers need to understand what companies are doing so that they can trust or understand what these new products are going to be, if they are going to be good for them. And all the different players need to be aware of what's happening with each other. I feel also as researchers, sometimes we are so into the lab and into the work and developing the technology that we tend to forget the implications of those technologies in society. So I think there's a lot of opportunity. We need more opportunities to actually engage and understand each of the different players.
Thank you. Well, that was great. So I think it just remains for me to thank the panelists. Thank you all. So Jadira, Helen, and Tom, and to remind you, those in the audience, that we have 2 more webinars. One next Monday, the 30th, same time, on the health dimensions, some of the debates around those, and then a 2-week break on July the 14th on the environmental dimensions of the discussion. Also, hopefully you will have had posted in the chat a feedback form. We really, really would ask you to fill that in if at all you can, as it will help us in shaping future events and learning from what we don't do right and what we do right. So I think that's it from me for now, and thank you very much, and I wish you all a good evening.
Thank
Goodbye.
you.